Good morning. My name is Mathew Frith. I'm the Director of Conservation for London Wildlife Trust, and I've been invited to start today's proceedings with a keynote presentation on a topic which perhaps I know quite a little bit in terms of its broad scope, but not with any great confidence of many of its details. As I suggest here, the title is What, Why and For Whom? And whilst the title of the conference is Outside the Honeypot, I would say this is very much from inside the honeypot. Our towns and cities are shaped by people, and one could arguably say that for much of the past few decades, if not many more, the place of nature is something which is an add-on, an externality to the city rather than part and parcel of the city. However, as we all know, life is a bit more complicated than that, and people living in the city have always take note of the kind of animals, plants and the natural life that they share the city with, although in past centuries, much of that may have been viewed with suspicion or with fear or with a degree of arrogance because of the way life was viewed in relation to humanity. But it was during the 17th century that we see the beginnings of the scientific revolution take place. And I'm talking very much from a London perspective. But in 1666, we had the Great Fire of London, which devastated the old medieval city. And in the year after, we see descriptions of plants growing in the ashes of the Great Fire, one of which was basically London rocket, a plant originally from Sicily on the kind of burnt slopes of Mount Etna, but had arrived in London through trade and did very, very well in the aftermath of the Great Fire. And it's an example, really, one of the first examples of where we see a wildflower being commented upon because it was growing in such profusion. Over the course of the next few decades, we begin to see men, and predominantly men, with a certain amount of time and money on their side, being able to take forward their observations and start recording them in a particular fashion. One particular favourite of mine is the Aurelian by Moses Harris, published in 1766. And in it, he records the butterflies and moths and other insects that he sees in his kind of promenades around London and around the hinterland of the city. And one particular species here shown on the far right, purple hairstrake, he records as being taken aplenty from the Oak of Honour Woods near Peckham in Surrey. Now, this site still survives. It's known as One Tree Hill in the London Borough of Southwark. And whilst there's not a huge number of oaks there, it is a site which one can almost feel, one can almost imagine Moses Harris sauntering through with his nets at that time, whisking away, trying to capture butterflies and moths and record them. Moving to plants, we have the work of William Curtis, one of London's first kind of methodical botanists, shall we say, creating and publishing 4 volumes of his Flora Londinensis between 1777 and 1798. His name is commemorated in a plaque on Bishopsgate in the Square Mile. And he produced these fabulous plates. It was a step forward from the herbals that had been published in the previous century or so. But it was in the Victorian period and the early Edwardian period that we see an explosion of interest, with groups of people gathering together in clubs and basically recording the nature they see on their doorstep, often basically taking advantage of the railway system to travel out from the inner city to places around about in the countryside which hadn't been heavily polluted or been disrupted by agricultural systems at that time. And these kind of explorations are recorded in these publications, which, it doesn't take much to find these days, but they are a fantastic insight into the particular kind of, should we say, the interests of the time. And what they don't really capture is the beginning of the declines of nature, which are so familiar to us today. Here's just another fine photograph, and I'm pleased to say it's not just men. There's men and women here from society in Chester on a day trip to Anglesey, and they would have been recording plants, they would have been recording birds, and they would also have been taking note of the weather as well. There's lots of kind of detailed weather observations recorded in these journals. Jumping forward to the middle of the 20th century, we start to see the impacts, shall we say, of a new approach to designing and managing our cities. The rapid growth of Victorian cities, fueled by coal and the industrial revolution, had led to massive pollution, massive development of slums, cities riddled with really very kind of unpleasant living conditions. And what in the 1940s, through both the impacts of the First and the Second World Wars did, was to basically suggest that there were different ways of planning our cities. And an example here is from the 1943 County of London plan, which shows the kind of open spaces which were being designed at that time, some of which were eventually created in London. And the front cover of the book on the left-hand side there is by Richard Fitter, London's Natural History, perhaps still the best book of a kind of description of London's nature up until when it was published in 1945. And again, an interesting insight to the kind of changes that had occurred in the previous 50 years and some of his projections for the decades to come. For example, he assumed that grey herons would never basically return to London because the rivers were so polluted. The River Thames was effectively biologically dead at that time. So again, a wonderful snapshot, but in some ways it captures the kind of reasons why we need to record nature and what purpose those records can be put to in terms of shaping the city, for not only for us to live in, but for the cities that nature can embrace as well. And that was given further impetus in the 1970s through work by a number of writers and a number of, shall we say, actions emanating especially from the Black Country, West Midlands. Gazetteer there, The Endless Village, is the first kind of document of its time published by the then Nature Conservancy Council, the government agency, actually recording post-industrial sites for the first time. They'd taken their eye off the wider countryside. And we've got writers like Tony Soper and Nan Fairbrother, a landscape architect who was brilliant at celebrating the kind of post-industrial landscape. Richard Mabey in his travails around what we call the unofficial countryside on the urban fringes. And we see the first expressions of newly created nature spaces such as William Curtis Ecological Park, right by Tower Bridge. By the end of the 1970s and the early 1980s, we have the creation and the establishment of more groups. And from my own perspective, the London Wildlife Trust was established in May 1981. We convened a two-day, well, our founders convened a two-day conference in a secondary school, and 400 people paid a £5 admission charge to hear about presentations on the wildlife of the rubbish tips and wildlife of the canals, etc., etc. Now, what the London Wildlife Trust was doing was somewhat different to the long-standing London Natural History Society, which had become established in 1858. And like so many of the Victorian Edwardian naturalist societies, had been very good at recording and listing species and describing habitats and places and presenting those in their annual journals. But arguably, and this is perhaps rather contentious, and whilst the London Natural Society did do some excellent advocacy in the 1940s, certainly by the 1970s, a lot of their work was focused on recording rather than perhaps action. An example of this was the publication of the Flora of the London Area in 1983, which is actually now currently being reviewed for a much awaited update. It's fantastic for the scientists, it's fantastic for the botanists, this publication, but for the many people who wanted to do something for their own kind of space on the doorstep, it was all a bit too scientific. You know, if you note there, if you can read that small print, yeah, the plants are described in their scientific names. They're not recalled by their common name. So it's something which is, again, a barrier which the London Wildlife Trust was very keen on breaking down. And the trust was set up on a very different basis, really. It was about action. It was about action to save places from being built on. It was about creating spaces for nature which people could visit free of charge. They didn't have to know 400 scientific names of plants to be allowed entry. They didn't have to be vetted to become a member in that sense. It was about creating spaces for the people of London. And it was also about challenging the kind of desire to fill every bit of green space with bricks, which, whilst perhaps wasn't the real policy of London at that time, was certainly something that many people were very much concerned about. And if we were going to conserve nature in London in the early 1980s, if we were relying on the designated site system, we had this number of sites at that period of time. And to be frank, whilst those sites are very, very important, they are they're not really going to help save and protect the nature of London, which we know is a much more complex than that. The Wildlife Trust kicked off by teaming up with Capital Radio with a 2-year wildlife watch project. This is just one form here, asking people to see where they saw hedgehogs. I think it's fair to say that that didn't get a huge amount of success. I think it was early days for the trust. And also the methods for both circulating that information and receiving it and doing something meaningful with, we didn't really have the capacity to do that with. What we thought was actually perhaps more important was to actually map the city. The sites of special scientific interest didn't really tell the whole story. And so we knocked on the door of the then Greater London Council, convinced them to impart a sum of money to employ 8 people to work 2 years, mapping the whole of the city, or as much of the city they could get access to, bar people's private gardens, and to record the habitats that they found here. So this is the London Wildlife Habitat Survey, 2 publications of ours at the time, just kind of reporting on some of the progress. And it was all done on 1 to 10,000 Ordnance Survey maps printed out, and then with paper and pen and crayons. Each of the habitats, which had a different kind of colour or a different kind of hatching, was drawn across every site that was visited and given a number. And this is just a site in East London known as Barking Reach at that time, site of a large power station, and the 4 Dagenham works there on the right-hand side. And at the time, there was no CCTV cameras. A lot of the fencing was kind of patchy. People could access that quite quickly. And the team went around on public transport, on bicycles and on feet. And within 2 years, they'd covered 1,500 sites. All that information was then basically audited and analysed, and then through the work of one of the organisations that came out of the abolition of the Greater London Council in 1986, the London Ecology Unit, the start of basically analysing and setting out that information to give us the framework of sites of importance of nature conservation that are still within London planning policy today. So from my understanding, London was the first city to do this, not only in the UK, but in the world. And it was about responding to a site system that didn't really work very well for urban areas and complementing it with so what's known as a non-statutory local wildlife site system, which is much more related to the planning world rather than kind of statutory designations per se. The SSSIs in London, which are now 37, are within the sites of importance for nature conservation, but obviously they enjoy greater levels of protection. The Trust then, on the sort of basis of this work, started to push much harder on what we now know as kind of citizen science, inviting the public to tell us where they saw certain species. And I've got no idea how these species were chosen, but one of those surveys, we'd undertaken bee spree, we've undertaken an owl prowl, and in 1988 we conducted kestrel count. And this is the kind of front page of the leaflet that went out to people that wanted copies of it, possibly partly based on a young ornithologist club kestrel survey, and also coincidentally running alongside a kestrel count in Leicester, but promoted very heavily with a lot of media work through local newspapers and through regional newspapers such as the Evening Standard and the national press as well, as you can see here from the right-hand side of the Daily Telegraph. From that survey, 2,642 sightings, giving us kind of an extrapolation from the sightings, which were all drawn on Ordnance Survey maps there. You can see the symbols of male, female, which is either because we didn't know or because they were both were seen as a breeding pair. But you can see this is how this data was analysed and recorded at that time. But more importantly, in many ways, was not just about the data per se, but the correspondence that it yielded in terms of what people saw, how they explained that, how they may have talked to friends about it. And this is just an example of one of the many, many letters we received during that kestrel count. And again, here, just a guy talking about, sorry, a woman just talking about a neighbour reporting them at the Ford Works in Dagenham, which he and his mates had been observing. So there's this kind of cultural information I think is really important to capture. It gives us an idea of just how likely, we could repeat this survey, because do kestrels touch a nerve? Well, they clearly do. People had a fondness for them and were quite happy to sort of spend time writing letters telling us that in some detail. And that has continued to this day. Obviously, with social media, the power of Twitter and Facebook, we get these kind of images being sent to us on a kind of regular, almost daily basis. What is this, basically? And correctly identified here, coming through a couple of years ago. The Trust basically set up the foundations of a local record centre for London in 1996-97, and that became Green Space Information for Greater London, which now holds millions of species and habitat data on its database. And from that, we can extrapolate that London is a lot more diverse than many people think in terms of its nature. Over 15,000 species of animal, plant and fungi on its database. So it's a lot more than rats, pigeons and foxes. And a lot of that data comes from specialist organisations. Some of it comes from county recorders, but much more of it actually comes from the public. And it's this ability to capture public information, which I think is a real important value to sort of use when we're trying to influence the decision makers for the city itself. By the late 1990s, the Biodiversity Action Plan had kind of taken root, And these are just two reports published in 1999 and 2000, which was capturing the data from the various surveys that have been carried out over the previous 20, 30 years. But we continue to undertake citizen science surveys. One particular species, which is a particular favourite of mine, stag beetle, we started that in 1997. Here's a local authorities version of getting that data for their local biodiversity action plan, one of our mid-2000s leaflets. And that went in parallel with the work carried out at a national level by the People's Trust for Endangered Species, which were the kind of lead for stag beetle under the National Biodiversity Action Plan. Over a period of decades, we have captured this amount of information, all stored on GIGGLE's database, but gives us what I still think is a rather interesting distribution of the species in London, predominantly in the south, with a few patches of kind of widespread presence in the north, but gaps here and there where perhaps you least expect it, particularly in northwest London, for reasons that we still don't know. But more importantly, perhaps, was what went out with that information, because the correspondence that we got from people was telling just how important they felt, how amazing these insects were to them, or how frightening indeed some of these insects were to them. But we knew that they were very much dependent on dead wood for their life cycle, and that they had suffered declines from the tidying up of parks, the removal of dead wood. And over the course of the next 10, 15 years, we have seen hundreds of parks and other open spaces basically incorporating loggeries as a proxy for providing habitat for saproxylic insects and fungi. And that's all been done basically on the back of the stag beetle as a kind of flagship for this type of habitat. And we still get images sent to us every year. So we launch our survey roughly at the end of May and through to the end of August. And people send us videos, they send us images, and they tell us stories about stag beetles they've seen. And these are just a couple from the last few years. Another iconic species is black redstart, a Schedule 1 protected species, rarer than the golden eagle in the UK. But for those of us who love and work in London, we know that it has resonance with the post-Blitz bomb sites of the Square Mile, here captured on Elliot Hodgkin's paintings of 1945, showing the kind of flourish of rose bay willow herb and docks, dandelions, Canadian goldenrod, wild onions, etc., which kind of adorned these bomb sites, but also became the kind of breeding grounds for black redstart. Those bomb sites had survived through to the 1980s, at least, to the early 1980s, before London started to change in its kind of population. Its population had declined between 1939 and 1988. And many of us were beginning to see the value of these for biodiversity. Later in the 90s and early 2000s, it was quite clear that groups like BugLife and people with an interest in beetles recognise that these brownfield sites, or what we now call as open mosaic post-industrial sites, are fantastic for a whole range of invertebrates. And what the biodiversity action plans and the work that we were doing through the Black Redstart Action Plan helped us to shape the city further. So here is a site known as Deptford Creek on the boundaries of Greenwich and Lewisham, right by the River Thames. This spills out into the River Thames, and this area had been surrounded by empty brownfield land, all ripe for development at the end of 1990s. But it just so happens there was a breeding pair of black redstart, and the developer had to do something. And whilst what we eventually did wasn't much COP, it led to a group of us basically providing much more detailed information for developers and planners, most of which had never heard of a black redstart, let alone know what it looked like or what its needs were. But basically that led to the idea of creating habitat for this species, but also benefiting other species as well, onto roofs, and other interventions came on the back of this, particularly to conserving the plants that had taken root on the wall sides of the creek. It eventually led to what I call the modern renaissance of green roofs in London and further afield. And the report there on the left-hand side, published in 2019, just basically gives us a case study of 10 years of the amount of work that's been done to try and create habitat for a range of species on new buildings in London. Well over 167 hectares in total. And the example here is in Aldgate, just a stone's throw effectively from the Tower of London. And this is about 9 or 10 stories high. And when I took this photograph, I could hear wren, blackbird. There was a starling bathing in one of the pools. And there are loads of bumblebees around. So these places work, and further surveys of green roofs in London has shown that they do work for biodiversity if they are designed right, and utilising the surveys collected from either bird watchers, entomologists or botanists going up on these sites and getting a feel of how they operate. And that science is continually evolving to inform how our city works into the future. But it's going even further into the kind of city centre. We've been working on a project with the Crown Estate, Grosvenor and other landlords, along with Arup in the West End, a project called Wild West End. And this is just a piece of work here, which we undertook about 5 years ago, which was recording pretty much every window box, flower pot, raised bed, tree in a large bucket kind of stuff, in and around the Wild West End, to try and get an idea of the amount of greenery in this part of London. And of course, by that time, smartphones were the kind of ordinary tool that everybody had to hand. And the picture circled there is just a woman taking a photograph of the window boxes. And effectively what our surveyor was doing was exactly the same. And this kind of tool has just basically revolutionized how we record the city in a way which I'm sure you'll all understand. And of course, this information has all been collated and further kind of digested into much more detailed guidance. And this is just a snapshot of stuff over the last 20 years. And there's plenty of more of these where they come from. Basically there to advise developers, planning and policy advisors on how we can create spaces for nature right into the heart of the city. And going back to those brownfield sites where the shrewel carder bee or the streaked bombardier beetle or indeed black redstarts, there are now people working on how we can mimic those habitats, but perhaps in a much more gardened, much more people-friendly way, rather than having a hulk of a rusting car or dumped builder's rubble in which nature just happens to find a home, but for us is just a little bit still too untidy, a bit too nature being too wild. Moving into our river systems, I think it's fair to say that ever since the 1950s, we've been slowly, but not necessarily as quickly as we'd like, clearing up our dirtied waters. And again, there's another flagship species that helped us on their way. In the city, perhaps it's more to do with water voles than, say, salmon in the wider countryside. But in the early 2000s, it was recognised that the water vole was our fastest declining mammal in the UK. And that work to try and recall where they were and where those habitats where they could restore populations if we were able to, where that could happen, was undertaken over a period of years in the capital with a number of partners, including ourselves, the Environment Agency, British Waterways, etc., etc. That in turn led to a wider group of people to come together to basically set up the London Rivers Action Plan. And over the course of the last 22 years or so, those river systems in London have slowly been taken out of their concrete culverts, their straitjackets, and renaturalised as best possible, not just for nature, but as much to do with flood resilience and also for people's enjoyment, as it's arguably a much more beautiful much more attractive site. So this is a site in South London, Ladywell Fields, which again the river went through in a kind of straight concrete jacket, and it's been kind of broken out with backwaters and shallow riffles, etc. And you just watch people playing in those waters during a summer's day, gives you an idea of their attraction. There are now also means to help our statutory agencies who've been rather hollowed out by austerity to try and map out where pollution incidents are occurring. So Zoological Society for London has been leading on outfall safaris, basically walking up rivers. So people in waders basically walking up rivers and recording these outfalls and seeing what they find on them, whether there are high levels of sewage, which they can trace back to misconnections, etc. And that work is informing catchment plans and works to restore rivers, advise the water companies as well as the Environment Agency. Water quality monitoring, for example, is undertaken through riverfly monitoring and through through species surveys for particular taxa. That has led to the slow clearing up of rivers, like removing debris and restoring those rivers to as much of a natural character as possible through direct interventions such as we've got here. And there's over 10 kilometres of rivers have been restored in the last 3 or 4 years, to give you an idea of the kind of extent and the amount of activity in this particular habitat. Another example of work that we've been doing at the Trust is trying to get a guide to the dragonflies and damselflies of London. There hasn't been one produced before, but this has been very much for a lay audience, or should we say a slightly informed audience, rather than those who have a detailed interest in the Odonata. We also continue monitoring our sites, engaging our staff and volunteers and interested members of the public in all manner of monitoring schemes, such as bird ringing here at Walthamstow Wetlands, of course, to monitor how we manage our sites for their nature and also for their people. But it's fair to say that some of those species are not necessarily wanted in the numbers that some of us feel comfortable with, although I'd argue that over Canada geese. And it's interesting that a number of projects have wanted Canada geese strategies in place. And of course, what the kind of monitoring has shown us is that the numbers aren't really reflected by perceptions. So this particular goose management strategy in the Wandle Valley was based because everybody could say, well, there's at least 100 Canada geese or so, and I'm kind of being flippant here, is found in every park on the Wandle. But of course, closer monitoring would show that it was a mobile population that was moving over the area over the course of a day. And so people were seeing the same birds over and over again. And so that has led to different strategies, which are basically recognizing the complexities of species and their interactions with the urban environment. And of course, we've got species which are much more difficult to eradicate, such as red swamp crayfish here, and oak processionary moth. But again, we're relying as much on whether it's organisations like the Wildlife Trusts or local authorities or the general public to tell us where they see things in order to help inform site managers to manage their sites, either for the protection of nature or for, in this particular case with oak processionary moth, to maintain elements of public safety. And in terms of OPM, that's all captured in the new London Urban Forest Plan, which again is informed by data from a whole range of sources. And one of particular interest of ours is deer, increasingly coming into the city's outer fringes. And we've been running fairly low key a deer survey over the last 5 or 6 years, which gives us this kind of data. These are meant to be of the wild deer, not those in the kind of herds that you see at Bushy Park or Richmond Park. But again, some surprising presence there right into the centre of the city, probably muntjac, but even so, the issue here is if deer numbers are spreading and their deer numbers are rising, what are the impacts going to be on the woodlands, which so far haven't had to deal with deer numbers in any great with any degree of concern. That is beginning to change. And the Trust has a number of public-facing surveys now, all web-based, all directly linked to Giggle, and all basically promoted through social media to try and reach them far and wide. We're utilising digital technology and apps. So we had an urban urchins project looking at hedgehogs, giving an example of where people were seeing them, because there was a fear the only colony in central London was at Regent's Park. We know that they are present in other parts of London as well, but certainly a declining species. And I just wanted to have a brief diversion to how people record the signs of the season. And one of the longest standing, which actually is a myth, was when people would write to the Times to tell when they'd first heard the cuckoo. And this is a great letter here from 2015. But what is interesting now is the cuckoo, as it's become rarer, I think has fallen out of the public gaze. And we know now that the seasons have been beginning to change because people beginning to notice things in a different way. And I just wanted to quickly divert to the work of Jean Coombs, who was living in Ashstead, Surrey in the late 1940s. And she was basically recording when certain tree species came into bud and into leaf and into blossom. And over that period of time, she was beginning to show how those were beginning to change. So her data showed that over a period of kind of 50 years, oak was leafing earlier, ash and horse chestnut have been leafing earlier since 1970, and lime was probably leafing earlier since 1980, but the trend is less clear. And there's a lot more information packaged into that. But this kind of nature's calendar is something that in the last perhaps 8-9 years has become recognised as a fantastic vehicle for gathering citizen science data to help us inform how nature is responding to seasonal change, which we probably know is being influenced very much by climate. The cuckoo is perhaps being replaced by the swift. And here's an example of one of the many, many kind of local swift groups up and down the country, often basically listening for the first swifts skeetering over their homes and then recording them. But of course, that's leading directly to action. People so love swifts and so want to do something for them, then it's not just about listening out for them, it's providing homes and nesting sites for them in a way that our buildings no longer do, because we build them in a kind of airtight fashion. And so that, again, that relationship is leading to action, not on the ground in this case, but in buildings. And in the same way, we've been seeing changes in gardens. A study that we undertook with Giggle and the Greater London Authority looked at the changes in garden vegetation between 1998 and 2006-07. And over that period, we found that 3,000 hectares of vegetation had been removed, including 1 million trees, equivalent to 2.5 Hyde Parks disappearing each year in London. Now, the climate impacts of that, let alone the impacts of nature, would be profound. And of course, there's still this understanding that everybody has access to green space. And one of the founding principles of the kind of early policies in the 90s with the sites of importance for nature conservation was to make sure they were integrated to trying to reduce the areas of deficiency, which are basically 1 kilometre from an area of easily accessible, public accessible, high quality natural environment, which is equating to a site of wildlife importance, of borough or regional value. Because clearly there are spaces like this, which you could argue ain't much cop for wildlife, and apart from the occasional footballer, ain't much cop for people. And then again, this work led to huge amounts of guidance published over the course of the 2010s, the decade before, about how we could improve our parks for people and wildlife. And then at a regional level, we've been particularly focused on the fact that London is growing, London's being impacted by climate change, and that people's concerns for nature needed to take more seriously. 10 million people are projected to be living in London by 2027, 2030, and that means spaces are going to be built on. So how do we do our best to try and articulate, both in terms of stories, in terms of data, in terms of, dare I say it, pounds, shilling and pence, the value of keeping much of London green as possible? If we can't keep it green, how do we create new green? And some of this work has been commissioned by the Greater London Authority and some of it by the Forestry Commission. And two examples here, looking at the value of the urban forest. So £133 million of ecosystem service benefits a year. And then also for public open green space, £5 billion worth of ecosystem services a year. So this is, whilst it's not necessarily yielding great pounds, shillings and pence, it is beginning to inform us in terms of where best to focus our activity. So here you would argue it's in Barking and Dagenham on the right hand side, not so much in Richmond, which is much wealthier, but also where those value of those mental health savings could be projected as well. So there's a whole range of data that comes out of this work to help us inform where we might want to invest in improving the quality of our natural green spaces, create new natural green spaces so they can provide those greater ecosystem benefits. And none more so than the impact of climate change, which we know the impacts here in London and our bigger cities are probably going to be more acute because of the urban heat island effect, as we can see here, and how that may be, for example, mitigated to some degree through providing more tree canopy cover, which will provide more shade and more moisture in the air. And here again, some more work that's been undertaken by the Greater London Authority, which is leading to where we identify spaces for new tree planting, or from our perspective, spaces where nature is allowed to take her own course and we allow for natural regeneration. But just as importantly, it's about recognising which spaces in London are going to be highly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, and none more so than the landscapes of social housing, whose landscapes are largely fairly devoid of any great interest or value, and basically ripe for improving, not only for wildlife, but for people as well. And there's some examples there from work undertaken by Groundwork. And in this image, some work that we've undertaken over the last 5 or 6 years, providing guidance on how to adapt landscapes for social landlords and actively engaging with resident communities on projects like creating rain gardens, either in their nearby roadside or in their housing estates per se. It's about creating these natural estates and, we hope, allowing people to have direct contact with nature in a way that not able to do so because they either don't know such places exist within maybe a kilometre of their home, or for various other reasons, time, money, cultural barriers, etc., they would never meet a grass snake on a day. So this is again back to the work that we and many organisations do to reduce this disconnection, bring nature close to where people are, to help inspire curiosity and hopefully enable people to start taking action to address both the climate and the extinction crisis. Finally, I just want to come to one story which has inspired us. The photograph on the left-hand side was sent to us by somebody visiting one of our nature reserves and said, "This landed on my boyfriend's trousers. Can you tell us what it is?" Now, this site is in South London. This butterfly is a Glanville fritillary, notionally only found on a few sites on the southwestern coast of the Isle of Wight and a site in Dorset. What was it doing in London? Well, there's a story there I can't really tell you, But let's put it this way, the habitat at our site in South London is perfect for Glanville fritillaries. And in the dim and distant past, it was actually known as a Dulwich fritillary. So at one stage, it did used to be part and parcel of our biota. That led in some ways to a project that we've been working with Butterfly Conservation, Natural History Museum and Croydon and Bromley councils called Brilliant Butterflies, which is partly about looking at both traditional survey methods, but also looking at preparing for new survey techniques led by the Natural History Museum using environmental DNA, using malaise traps, pitfall traps, soil samples, etc., and undertaking a lot of that analysis both in the field and in the laboratory. I think it's fair to say I don't really understand the complexity of it, but it is about providing us with new techniques to capture a lot more than the traditional recording techniques we're doing, which is basically focusing on the big day-flying butterflies and some of the moths with moth trapping. This eDNA is allowing us to investigate much broader biodiversity on these sites, and it may even change how we manage these sites in the future, because maybe we're missing a trick. Are there beetles which we've kind of forgotten about because we've never really looked for them? These are the questions that this project is posing. But of course, we're not losing sight about the fact that we need to restore and create new habitat. So here's an example of one of these habitat banks that we're creating on a school not far on fairly rank ryegrass grassland, exposing the chalk bank, and this has been seeded with green hay and with plug plants. But it's critically about engaging new audiences. We must never lose sight of whom and why we're doing this. Yes, of course, it's about capturing the data of the species that we share our city with, but it's as much about who we're doing it for and engaging those future audiences. Can we sustain the lockdown interest in the natural world, which many of us thought was happening last year? I hope so. For me, it's about inspiring those new generations to keep their eyes open, their ears open, and to become inspired in the natural world around them. And for most people in this country, that's in towns and cities, because that's where most of us will be continuing to live into the future. And to end, I just want to send show this picture. This was sent through to us last summer. Somebody thought they saw a tuatara in a suburb in North London. So it takes all sorts, and I'm afraid we had to disappoint them on this occasion, but thank you very much for listening.